The cost of capital is one of the drivers of abnormal operating income in the economic profit framework. Have you wondered what really drives the weighted average cost of capital? In this video, we look at how we include risk, the cost of capital, as one of the drivers of economic profit. It is easy to think that the cost of capital for operations, or the WACC, is derived from the cost of capital for equity and the cost of capital for debt. After all, the formula indicates the cost of capital for operations can be calculated as the weighted average of ROE and ROD. Indeed, the cost of capital for operations is usually referred to as the weighted average cost of capital, WACC, in finance textbooks. However, this formula simply sets out the relationship between WACC, ROE and ROD. This same formula could just as easily be expressed as the cost of capital for equity, ROE, equals the weighted average of WACC and the cost of capital for debt. Or, cost of capital for debt equals the weighted average of WACC and the cost of capital for equity. As you can see, cost of capital for equity, ROE, could just as easily be viewed as the weighted average of the cost of capital for operations, WACC, and the cost of capital for debt, ROD. Or, cost of capital for debt, ROD, could be viewed as the weighted average of the cost of capital for operations, WACC, and the cost of capital for equity, ROE. It is purely a matter of convenience to refer to the cost of capital for operations as the weighted average of cost of capital rather than the cost of capital for equity or the cost of capital for debt. As we have seen, the familiar finance formula that shows the cost of capital for operations as the weighted average cost of capital does not imply that WACC, or the cost of capital for operations, is derived simply from a weighted average of ROE and ROD, with the weighting depending on a firm's level of gearing. A moment or two of reflection should make this clear to us. Both the cost of capital for equity and the cost of capital for debt will be driven by the cost of capital for operations, by the risks inherent in the business rather than the other way around. In determining their required rate of return, both providers of equity and debt capital will consider the risks of a firm's business or operations relative to the risks they would face with alternative investment opportunities. There is an interaction between supply and demand for capital in the capital markets and between the risks of a firm's operations and the requirements of providers of capital based on the amount of capital they have and the risks of other investment alternatives they face. However, fundamentally, risk and the rate of return required to compensate providers of capital for assuming these risks comes from a firm's operations and not from the capital markets and not from anywhere else. For further information on the cost of capital, go back to Chapter 6, Section 6.2 in the study guide, and also review Focus on the Enterprise weekly questions. Also answer, write and rate questions in Peerwise.